This is Behind the Headlines, with behind-the-scenes analysis on issues affecting Pennsylvanians, sponsored by the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. Now, here's your host.
Hi, from Philadelphia to Erie and from Pittsburgh to Scranton. It's Behind the Headlines. And on this particular edition of Behind the Headlines, I'm lucky to be joined by Mr. Ed Arnold, who is the chairman of Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. Ed, welcome back to the show.
Good to see you, Charlie.
It's nice to see you. Thank you for joining us. And we want to talk about something that is of great interest to many people around the nation, and of great interest to you. You have been involved with higher education all your life. You are currently on the board of Lebanon Valley College, I believe, and you've been on the library board. You're on the library board of Notre Dame. You have been one of the greatest philanthropists in the country as far as higher education is concerned. So you follow what's going on college campuses, and again, full disclosure, my other job is a professor of government and political affairs as well. So today we'd like to talk about the issue of free speech, particularly on college campuses. And this is part of a larger subject of political culture, something that many of our elected officials don't have a good understanding of. We saw that when we looked at the Iraq War and how the Bush administration had no idea of the political culture of Iraq and what was going to happen after the initial invasion. One component of political culture, I guess I should just for a moment mention what political culture is. It's the expectations that we have for government and for politics, the belief system that people have on how government and politics should operate. And part of political culture, of course, is political tolerance. Political tolerance is your willingness to let everyone have their say. In other words, your willingness to let other people have the right to freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and the right to petition the government. And political tolerance has traditionally increased in a society with more education. That has gotten hung up recently in higher education in America, and that is tied up with this whole issue of freedom of speech on campus. What has happened to freedom of speech on the campus? You find that at my own university, back in 1996, Pat Buchanan, one of the leading conservatives in the country, was running for president, and I had him on campus, and our university students listened to him. There were some that agreed and some that disagreed, but everybody had a chance to question him, and everybody had a civil discussion and an exchange of viewpoints. We find that just 5 years ago, several years later from that incident, we had a pro-life group come to campus, and they set up an exhibition, and within an hour and a half, there were two large groups of students that gathered. One was pro-life, one was pro-choice, and they were screaming at each other. We needed to put the university police between them to keep them from fisticuffs. What has happened? Why can't we exchange viewpoints with others that we don't agree with in a civil fashion? And this has happened not just at my university, but across the country. What is your take on this, Ed? What have you seen when it comes to free speech on campuses?
Well, I think one of the biggest problems is that the strength of America is that we have an extremely liberal, very open, our definition of free speech and what people are allowed to say in public is very different from even Europe. And that is that in America, it doesn't mean nice speech. It says you have the right to say anything unless it libels somebody or unless it causes danger, such as yelling fire in a theater. So therefore, you can say very derogatory terms to somebody, which are not nice. The N-word is one would be, and so on. But this is not outlawed. it is not nice, and it shouldn't. It should be. We should teach people to be civil to each other. But to say that a person can't say this and we should outlaw it, which basically means we're saying you don't have free speech anymore. That overall, we are now using the word, like if a speaker comes to your school, first of all, more and more they will not allow him to speak. But I'll get to that in a minute. But there, people have made the statement, I feel endangered by this speaker. That is a totally misrepresentation of the English language. Obviously, you're uncomfortable, you're angry, you're unhappy with the speaker, but in no way are you endangered. And this is what has happened now. We're saying you got to protect people from being endangered from free speech. This is very sad. And therefore, what we've had more and more, we have conflicts now that because, just as you had mentioned with yours, people can't have a debate, maybe even a heated argument. So their solution now is to shout down anybody that disagrees with them and don't listen. College is supposed to be a place of debate, yet now it's become a place of political correctness.
Well, and we think that there are way too many students watching too many episodes of the Jerry Springer Show. They think that you exchange viewpoints by screaming your lungs out at one another. It's very unfortunate.
No, that there is no tolerance anymore, that we basically, this whole area of, well, overall, what groups, as an example, who now decides what is politically correct? This is censorship, and nobody seems to care about that. And it's very interesting because if you talk something about, campus or in a public setting about Christianity, about the Bible, that's bad. But if you talk about Muslims and the Quran, that's okay. Who has decided this? The mob, the extreme liberals, those who shout down others, those who are willing to be the most violent. That this is, and this also the idea that all whites are bad. This is a rather ridiculous statement. We fought for integration, but now we want segregation. The students, a lot of your African American students say they want their own housing, they want this, they want that, they want to have their own areas. What happened to, we should be, again, college should be a mingling area where you exchange thoughts and attitudes and learn about others.
Martin Luther King was concerned about the content of one's character and not about the color of one's skin. But this goes back to just recently to an incident at Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington, where they had a practice of one day during the year, the African American students left the campus. This year, for whatever reason, that community decided to issue a request to everybody else that was not of color to leave the campus. Everyone had to leave the campus, and only individuals of color could stay on campus. And there was one Jewish professor, apparently, who he's a liberal professor, but he said, this has nothing to do, what does this have to do with my classes? I'm paid to conduct my classes, I'm going to conduct my classes. And there was a large mob of students that went to him and demanded that he shut down his class. And when he refused to shut down his class, they went to the president's office. By the way, the president was in the process of leaving the campus, but they demanded that Jewish professor be fired because he did not leave campus.
Well, Charlie, there was a lot more they demanded. This is the whole thing. They marched into the office with no respect. They just said they demanded. When the president asked them politely that, look, I'll read your demands, we'll talk about them later, but in this environment of you shouting and screaming, and they refused. They called the professor the F word, he's a scumbag, he's this, and extremely disrespectful, and refused to leave, even though he was trying to be very accommodating. But this is the saddest part of that story, is that they finally, on their terms, left. There was no disciplinary action. Actually, the campus police were told by the president to stand down, as opposed to basically bringing order to the situation. Overall, we have this problem now where the authority is no longer in charge. And would you really want your kids to go to this college where they are not necessarily safe because the mob runs Evergreen College ever done, because the president, obviously, he commended these students that said, gee, I'm glad they brought these things to my attention. Going in and calling him names, demanding it to it now, demanding, and he said that was a good thing.
Well, Ed, there is one organization, I believe you know it well, it's called FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, and they keep track of all these situations and incidents throughout history. Could you talk a little bit about FIRE?
Well, FIRE basically is a First Amendment enforcer. Our Constitution obviously allows freedom of speech, as we talked about earlier. And therefore, they have now, there has been rulings by the Supreme Court in more recent times that overall a professor or students have the right to free speech on campus. And therefore, they have brought legal action where these free speech codes, so you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do that. They have, when a professor, let's say, would do something, put a simple sign on his door that let's make America great again, and he'd be threatened with discharge from his job because that was improper to do. They would come and defend him, and they have continually, students also, anybody on the campus, but primary students and faculty, their right to free speech, because that's in the Constitution. So FIRE overall, they have a strong legal staff. They, generally speaking, don't have to go to court, because once they really challenge the administration will basically back down and agree to modify their speech codes.
They're based in Philadelphia, is that correct?
That is correct, yes, they are.
Okay.
Yes, I have supported them for a long time. I've even visited them in Philadelphia.
Okay. And they will send speakers out to organizations that request that?
That is correct, yes.
Okay.
They are trying to educate the people to their rights under free speech. They obviously made their presence known, so if a student is, as an example, again, where a student is purported to have done something wrong, there is no judicial process. He is just expelled because he said something, or for that matter, let's say he was pro-life. All of a sudden, you're not allowed to be pro-life anymore. That is not politically correct. And so therefore, he can be, if he insists on having a group on his campus and they want to have a meeting and so on, he could be easily, and it has happened in fact, where they have defended cases like this, where he was basically dismissed from the school or major other disciplines with no due process.
Mm-hmm. Well, 3 quick cases before we go to break. Recently, we find that Manhattan Institute scholar Heather McDonald, of course, she's gotten in the news quite a bit over the last year because she has been what I would consider to be a thoughtful critic of Black Lives Matter, and she's the author of the book, The War on Cops. But she was to appear at UCLA. She was shouted down. Of course, we have the case of the conservative Charles Murray, who wrote the book on the bell curve. Charles Murray has worked for a variety of think tanks in Washington, D.C., such as the Urban Institute and the American Enterprise Institute. He was shouted down by students at Middlebury College in Vermont. And that was followed by what was indeed a violent attack. And that attack sent his liberal sponsor, Professor Allison Stanger, to the hospital. She was his sponsor, and I believe she had a broken collarbone and some problems with her neck. We find that we can go back to 2006 to an incident that I remember seeing being reported at the time very clearly. This was from Columbia University. We had Jim Gilchrist. Jim Gilchrist was the president and founder of the Minutemen Project. The Minutemen Project were just volunteers, individuals who were willing to go to the southern border and sit with the lawn chair, and if they saw illegal immigrants coming across, they would pick up their cell phone and call the Border Patrol. And in fact, they had a project 2 weeks during the George Bush Jr. During the Bush W term, where they had a large presence and they cut illegal immigration by over 80% just with a bunch of lawn chairs and cell phones. Well, when Jim Gilchrist tried to go to Columbia University and speak, being invited by the college Republicans, you had the International Socialist Organization, the Chicano Caucus, the African American Student Organization. They stormed the stage, and the Columbia University police stood by without helping their guests or protecting them. Their own security guards turned the students back and the professors who were storming the stage, and then finally the Columbia University police were able to help protect them. But and that was all captured on the video. You just can't fathom these sorts of things during my time in college and the university, Ed. I guess you can't either.
No, as I said, who would want their kids at this point? Our society overall is tolerating violence, but it's the worst example really is in our universities, where there is overall right now, people are afraid to speak up if they're conservative or they have a non-popular view. And again, basically this whole thing on religion. I mean, obviously, if you have a view that you don't agree with the immigration policy, or you think criminals should continue to be protected in this country, or things like this, that you're not allowed to say that because you will cause an incident, and therefore administrations have more and more told you to be quiet because they don't want to have any incidents.
Okay, and I don't want any incident either, so we've got to go to break. We'll be back with the second segment of Behind the Headlines right after this. Stay tuned.
Behind the Headlines is brought to you as a public service by the Hospital and Health System Association of Pennsylvania, helping hospitals provide healing, health, and hope to communities across the state. And by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry. The Pennsylvania Chamber serves as the frontline advocate for business on Pennsylvania's Capitol Hill, by influencing the legislative, regulatory, and judicial branches of state government. Additional underwriting provided by the Worrell Corporation Foundation, based in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, by the Edward H. and Jeannie Arnold Foundation, and by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business. Behind the Headlines is also supported as a public service by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Visit pahighwayinfo.org.
Hi, welcome back to Behind the Headlines. My guest for this show this week is Mr. Edward Arnold, who is the chairman of the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy, and we are talking about free speech on campuses. And we found that this is an issue that is not a new one. It has been with us for over 50 years in different forms and in different manifestations. But we find that there's an assessment by some social observers that American colleges have descended into low-grade anarchy. I don't know, would you agree with that, Ed?
Unfortunately, yes. It is right now the backbone, as I would say, of our administration is that they are so afraid of basically a disturbance that therefore they've been intimidated to the point where they have pretty much outlawed free speech on campus, only nice speech or speech that is basically condoned by the mob, because that's what's being run in our schools.
You know, the immediate explanation, the most conventional wisdom says that this has been caused by the election of President Trump. But yet this anti-free speech movement has been active long before anyone could have imagined Donald Trump as the President of the United States. It's been happening over 50 years. We find that there have been, some people have looked at this and said there have been 4 waves in the history of this issue on college campuses. One that you probably remember very well started with the Vietnam War, and it was called the period of the young radicals. Here we have violent student protests in the 1960s, and we have that a lot of the students at that point were essentially neo-Marxists that thought that free speech and constitutional democracy were tools that were used by the ruling class to suppress dissent. I think you remember that time well.
Yes.
You had just graduated from college yourself. Did you see any of this on the college campus
Well, I
at the time?
remember, actually our campus, because the administration there was strong, there was no, the students were told very simply, you follow the rules or you're not going to attend the school. Where obviously in a lot of our state schools, they left it get out of control. Not really, but a lot of what you're talking about started with a political thing because of the riots against Vietnam, which was the presidential elections. And that sort of started the reverse of restricting free speech, in that they took the demonstrators, which were out of hand to a point, but they put them so far away they really restricted their right.
You're talking
to
about
assembly.
the 1968
Yeah.
Democratic presidential
And it continued in the other
convention.
ones. Actually, we've had, since that time, we have pretty much controlled our convention sites so that you don't, even the last one, even with Trump, which was controversial, you did not see any major rioting because they were put aside pretty far. Yes, there was some, the news today would cover it, but it was not close to disrupting, whereas it had been in the 60s.
Yeah. Then we find that these young radicals in the early to mid-1980s to the mid-1990s, they are leaving graduate school, and now they are acquiring positions within the academy. They are becoming junior professors. And this period of time, some people have referred to it as the Long March, that radicals are leaving graduate school and taking up junior faculty positions. And this is the beginning of the academic culture wars that we've seen. And of course, what happened is they started to do away with courses. They started to do away with courses having to do with Western civilization and having to do with civics. What do you think happens, Ed? What's the result of not having courses in Western civilization?
Well, unfortunately, more and
civics?
more our younger Americans really don't know what America's all about, because we aren't really teaching it in the K through 12, and obviously, therefore, they have no interest in taking those courses in college. And at one time, the colleges required that you took certain courses in Western civilization. They now, I'm not even sure they offer them, but if they do, they definitely don't require them. And we've also, the other area that we'd get back to is this whole idea of free speech zones, which actually goes back to your same time frame, 1984, where the Supreme Court ruled that Texas A&M, who had put a gazebo, this is a large university, and only in a gazebo did you have free speech.
And how large was the gazebo?
They said it could hold 200 people, so it was a large gazebo. But still, 200 people on a campus of probably 35,000.
And only 200 people at one time were allowed to speak freely.
That's correct.
With each other.
And this was ruled that it was illegal. Yet now, 1 in 6 colleges in America have free speech zones. That actually there has now been a movement, despite the fact that we have court rulings, which we seem to be ignoring. We only do the new left follow the rules they like. This is this whole thing. If you don't like a rule, you ignore it. Sanctuary cities obviously would be a similar one. But basically what we're talking about now, states have now are starting to pass laws that say, only because they can only control public universities, which is still 2/3 of our universities, that you cannot have free speech zones. You cannot restrict free speech. So at this point, you have the states of Kentucky, Missouri, Virginia, Arizona, Colorado, Utah. They have all, in the last 2 years, passed laws that said you cannot restrict free speech. So it seems that maybe the solution, which is sort of sad, since there is lack of a will on the part of the administration, they want to have peace. Thank you. That we now have to have legislation. We have to get backbone in the administration through the political process.
Is Pennsylvania on that list again, Ed, or not?
Pennsylvania is not. Penn State, unfortunately, is listed as one of the schools that has. They more limit their speech. 10 or over is extremely restricted.
10 people.
10 people. And they're, in theory, a person can do it, but their interpretation of offensive speech, it appears to be because of, unfortunately, the Sandusky problem and so on, that at this point they are bending over backwards to not almost allow people to speak their opinion if it's not nice. That
Okay.
the way they read, it's a matter of interpretation. But again, the administration doesn't want to push back against the extreme left.
Okay. Well, the last two phases of this protest against free speech on college campuses seems to have started in the mid-1990s. This is called the takeover period. Here you have now these radicals who had become professors. They become older professors. They control the hiring. And who do they hire? Only people of the same intellectual nature. They hire more of the same, and you have developing an intellectual monopoly of the left in many campuses.
Well, I think one of the things that to break this monopoly, we have now done in our schools, we have pushed very aggressively to make sure we hire minorities, teachers, I'm talking faculty now. Diversity. We also hire more and more females. We should now have a thing that says you must hire diverse thought, which means right now the overwhelmingly 90+% of our college professors are liberal or hard liberal, and there are very few conservatives. And of course, they perpetuate themselves as liberals, so therefore they continue to hire. So therefore, if we were to demand, just as we did, you must hire minorities professors, you must hire female professors, you must have professors who have a conservative viewpoint so that the students would get a rounding education and they would see all sides.
Mm-hmm. Well, the last wave of this movement against free speech on campuses is called the Transform Generation. And this is where we have this final wave of the anti-free speech movement, where we have late millennial students demanding safe spaces and trigger warnings, and this started around 2014. Jonathan Haidt, the author who wrote Why Good People Disagree About Religion and Politics, says it's all about parental coddling. Parental coddling and a whole series of curriculums, particularly for history, that emphasize group conflict and America's sin. And this is where we are now. We're in a position where even comedians won't come to college campuses because there's no humor. The kids won't laugh, whether it's Larry the Cable Guy on the right, Chris Rock on the left, or Jerry Seinfeld in the middle. No one feels comfortable coming to college campuses because they don't have a sense of humor anymore, Ed. Ed, in the last 30 seconds, how do we solve this?
Well, I think just to repeat that we have to create a new category of diversity of thought on our campuses to round it out, and overall that we just have to stop coddling, in a sense, at the university level, the radicals, and basically have discipline.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, we appreciate all that you've brought to this discussion, Ed, and this is a discussion that will continue. And we have a lot more to say about it, and we'll be doing that in the near future. We want to thank you for joining us for this edition of Behind the Headlines. See you next week.